His father's hand was flat against the barn wall in Telemark, the stone rough under his palm, hay dust caught in the blue winter light. The sheep stood calm inside, their breath-making clouds, and the boy asked why there was no draft when the storm outside bent the trees double. His father pointed down the entry passage. Low door, left turn, right turn, hay stacked to the ceiling on both sides, and said, 2 turns. The wind gives up. 20 years later, on a Nebraska homestead with a dead wife buried in the east draw and less wood than a family needs to survive a single month, that memory sat up like a man waking from a long sleep. The cabin sat 16 feet by 20 in a shallow draw north of Broken Bow, Nebraska, half sod and half rough frame, with a single plank door that faced west because the man who built it 4 years earlier had planned a summer lean-to he never finished. Now, in the first week of November 1887, that west-facing door was the only barrier between a dead woman's children and a prairie wind that had not stopped blowing since October. Torgrim Asen was 31 years old. His wife Guro had died 19 days ago, fever and hemorrhage after a birth that produced a boy who lived 37 hours. The baby was buried beside Guro on the east side of the draw, where the soil was soft enough to dig without a pickaxe. Torgrim had stood at the grave with his daughter Marin, 9, holding his left hand, and his son Bastian, 5, holding his right, and he had not spoken because there was nothing to say that the wind would not take. He owed $11.40 at the general store. He had 1 cord and 3/4 of cottonwood stacked against the cabin's south wall, 12 sacks of dried cow chips in a shallow pit behind the outhouse, and a straw pile from threshing season that sat in a loose mound 60 feet from the door. The straw was worth nothing. Everyone said so. You could twist it into knots and burn it for 10 minutes of weak heat, or you could bed cattle on it, or you could let it rot. Those were the choices for oat straw on the treeless plains, and none of them would keep a widower and 2 children alive until March. The Homestead Act required residence and continuous improvement on his 160-acre claim. 4 years of labor, breaking sod, digging the well, raising the frame walls, planting the first failed crop and the second crop that half succeeded, stood between Torgrim and ownership. If he abandoned the claim, he lost everything. If he stayed and ran out of fuel, he buried his children beside their mother. That was the arithmetic, 1 cord and 3/4 against a winter that would demand 6. Ephraim Dace arrived on the 9th day of November, riding a dun mare with a grain sack tied behind the saddle. He was 58, a road overseer and former freight hauler who had survived 3 decades on the plains by knowing exactly how much everything cost and exactly how little most men had. He did not knock. He pushed the door open, let the wind follow him in, and stood dripping snowmelt onto the packed earth floor while the stovepipe groaned from the gust. Marin pulled Bastian closer to the stove. The lamp flame went flat and almost died. Ephraim looked at the stove first. The collar where the pipe met the firebox had a crack running 2 inches along the seam, stuffed with clay that was already powdering. He looked at the woodpile visible through the door he had left open. He looked at the children. He looked at Torgrim, who stood at the table with a pencil and a torn envelope, doing sums. "Shut the door," Torgrim said. Ephraim shut the door. The stove took 40 seconds to recover. Torgrim had been counting recovery times for 9 days. "I came to see how you are fixed," Ephraim said. He said it the way a man says a thing he already knows the answer to. "You can see." Ephraim walked the cabin in 6 strides. He touched the sod wall on the north side, where frost had crept through and left a white fur on the interior surface. He crouched at the base of the west wall, where the frame timbers met the sod foundation, and pressed his thumb into a gap wide enough to slide a knife blade through. Wind sang through it, faint and constant, like a man whistling through his teeth. You have one door, Ephraim said. It faces the worst wind. You have a stove with a cracked collar. You have less than 2 cords. He straightened and looked at Torgrim without pity, because pity was not a resource. A family in this draw burns 6 cords before March if they mean to see spring. You are short by more than 4. You know that. Torgrim knew it. Your chips will carry you 3 weeks if you burn nothing else alongside them. Your cottonwood, burned careful, gives you maybe 6 weeks. That puts you into January. After that, you burn furniture or you freeze. I know the numbers, Torgrim said. Then you know the answer. Sell the claim. Take the children to town. Widow Hansen takes boarders. I'm not a widow. You are a man with a dead wife, 2 children, and less wood than a schoolhouse. Ephraim picked up his grain sack. I brought you 10 pounds of cornmeal because your wife was a decent woman. I did not bring you a miracle. He left the cornmeal on the table. He opened the door. The wind entered like a third person. The stovepipe groaned. The lamp flame pressed flat against the wick. Snow dust crossed the floorboards in a line so precise it looked drawn with chalk. Marin coughed. Ephraim looked at the line of snow on the floor. He looked at Torgrim. Every time that door opens, Ephraim said, you lose what took the stove 20 minutes to build. You open at 8, 10 times a day for water and stock and fuel and the outhouse. That is 3 hours of heat lost to openings alone. No trick replaces cordwood. Build a proper wooden entry or haul timber from the river, but do not stand here counting straw. He left. The door closed. The snow line stayed on the floor until Marin swept it with her sleeve. Torgrim looked at the envelope. His sums had not changed. The numbers sat in pencil, patient and lethal. 1 3/4 plus 12 sacks of chips minus 6 months of winter equaled a deficit he could not close by hauling, buying, or begging. The river timber was 14 miles southeast, frozen under bank ice, and he had no team strong enough to drag green cottonwood through December drifts. Cordwood from the settlement cost $3 a cord at summer prices and $5 at winter prices, and he had $4.60 to his name after the store debt. He could not leave. He could not stay. He could not afford the accepted solution. What he had was straw. The idea did not arrive like revelation. It arrived like a door opening at midnight. 3 nights after Ephraim's visit, Torgrim woke to Bastion whimpering. The stove had burned low. The cabin temperature had dropped far enough that frost was forming on the inside of the water bucket. Torgrim rose, pulled on boots, and opened the cabin door to fetch chips from the pit. The wind hit him in the chest. It was not the worst wind he had felt, not even close to the January gales that would come later, but it was steady, and it was 20 degrees below freezing, and it found every gap in his clothing in the time it took to cross the threshold. Behind him, the lamp flame went flat. Marin coughed awake. Snow dust crossed the floor. He hauled 4 chips from the pit, came back inside, and shut the door. The stove took nearly a minute to bring the air back. Bastion had stopped whimpering only because he had pulled the quilt over his face. Torgrim sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the stovepipe tick as the metal expanded. The cabin was a box. The door was a hole in the box. Every time he opened the hole, the box emptied itself of warmth like a bucket tipped on its side. Ephraim was right about the math. 8 openings a day, 20 minutes of recovery each, meant the stove spent nearly 3 hours a day just replacing what the door stole. That was fuel. That was heat. That was time borrowed from his children's survival. He thought about his father, not the whole of his father, not the man who had died before Torgrim left Norway, but one specific afternoon in Telemark when Torgrim was 11 and his father Halvor had taken him to the sheep barn during a storm. The barn was not warm the way a house was warm. There was no stove, but the sheep stood calm, their breath making clouds, and the air inside felt still. No wind, no draft. Torgrim had asked why. Halvor had pressed his palm flat against the barn wall. The wall was thick, double stone, filled with turf and packed with old hay. Cold does not walk in, Halvor had said. Wind carries it. Stop the wind, and cold must crawl. It is slow when it crawls. The barn entry turned twice. You walked in through a low door, turned left down a short passage stacked with hay on both sides, then turned right into the barn itself. Halvor had pointed at the passage and said, 2 turns. The wind gives up. That memory had lived in Torgrim for 20 years without being useful. Now it sat up in his mind like a man waking from a long sleep. He got up from the bed. He found a candle stub, a flour sack, and 2 wooden boxes on the shelf, one that had held nails, one that had held salt. He set the boxes on the table a foot apart with the flour sack draped over the top, making a short, straight passage. He lit the candle and set it at one end. Then he blew hard through the open end of the passage. The flame flattened and died. He rebuilt the passage with a bend. He set the boxes at an angle, offset so the opening on one side did not align with the opening on the other. He draped the flour sack again, lit the candle, and blew. The flame bent. It trembled. It did not die. Maren was watching from the bed. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Thinking about sheep," Torgrim said. He picked up the torn envelope and turned it over. On the back, in charcoal because his pencil had broken, he drew a passage, 20 feet long, 3 feet wide inside, 5.5 feet high because he was 5 feet 9 and would need to duck but not crawl. 2 turns, dog legs, not curves, so the wind could not find a straight path from outside air to cabin door. The walls would be straw bales, 2 bales thick on the windward side where the west gales hit, 1.5 on the sheltered side. The roof would be straw bales laid over willow poles and whatever scrap rafters he could salvage. The base would sit on sod blocks and flat stone to keep the straw off wet ground. The outside would get mud daubing, clay, dung, and chopped straw, and a sod cap to shed water. The cabin's plank door would stay. A second door of plank, scraps, and canvas would close the outer end. 2 doors, 2 turns, 20 feet of insulation between the prairie and his children. It was not a wall. It was not a windbreak. It was a passage that made the wind work so hard to reach the cabin door that most of its force would die in the straw before it arrived. An airlock, a vestibule built from the one material he had in abundance and no one else wanted. Torgrim looked at the drawing. It looked like a hallway for livestock. It looked like something a man drew at midnight when the cold had gotten into his thinking. It looked absurd. He looked at the woodpile through the darkness. 1 cord and 3/4. 12 sacks of chips, $4.60. He did not have a better idea. He did not have any other idea at all. Nasod. The straw pile sat 60 feet from the cabin door, a loose mound of threshed oat straw 8 feet high and 20 feet across, slowly compacting under its own weight, and the November rain that had soaked its outer layer to a dark gold crust. Inside, the straw was still dry, pale, dusty, smelling of summer and the work of August when Guro had been alive and the baby had not yet killed her. Torgrim needed tight bales. The straw was loose. He had no baling press. What he had was a wooden frame he built from scrap lumber, 4 boards nailed into a rectangle 2 feet by 3 feet by 18 inches deep, and his own weight. He forked straw into the frame, climbed in, stood on it, jumped on it, packed it with his boots until the straw compressed to half its volume, then tied it with baling wire he had traded his last good harness buckle to obtain. Each bale took 15 minutes. He needed somewhere between 80 and 100 bales. He started on the 12th of November. By the end of the first day, he had made 11 bales, and his back felt like someone had driven a fence post between his shoulders. Warren Plum rode past on the 14th. Warren was 36, a neighboring farmer with 3 sons, and the kind of practical confidence that comes from never having been desperate. He stopped his horse at the edge of Torgrim's property and watched for a full minute as Torgrim jumped up and down inside a wooden frame on a pile of straw. "What in God's name are you building?" Warren asked. "A passage," Torgrim said. He did not stop jumping. "A passage to where?" "From outside to inside." Warren looked at the cabin. He looked at the straw. He looked at Torgrim, who was sweating in November, which was not a thing that happened to men who were thinking clearly. "If straw made houses warm," Warren said, "we would all be living in threshing piles." "You are not building with straw," Torgrim said. "You are building with dead air. The straw holds the air still." Warren considered this. "And the mice, and the wet, and the fire?" "Those are problems," Torgrim admitted. "Those are not problems. Those are reasons." Warren shook his head. "You have children, Asen. Spend your time hauling wood, not jumping on straw." He rode on. Torgrim kept jumping. Bale 12, bale 13. His hands bled where the wire cut through his gloves. The trouble at the general store happened on the 16th of November. Torgrim went to trade straw. Yes, straw, the thing worth nothing, for more baling wire. He offered to stack winter bedding straw for any farmer who would give him wire in return. The storekeeper, a man named Gale, who kept his opinions folded inside his prices, said nothing. But Alva Rook was there. Rook was 44, a freight agent who ran wagons between Broken Bow and the rail station, and who sold cordwood at prices that rose with the temperature's fall. He owned a share in the general store's credit ledger, which meant he owned a share of Torgrim's $11.40 debt. He also owned an interest in the planned road that county surveyors had flagged through the draws north of town, an interest that would be worth considerably more if certain homesteads along the route became available for purchase at tax sale. Rook leaned against the counter with his arms folded and listened to Torgrim's straw-for-wire offer with the kind of smile that has teeth in it. "Asen," Rook said, "I hear you're building onto your cabin." "I am." "With straw." "With straw bales." "With straw bales." Rook repeated it slowly, as if tasting the words. "A hallway, made of straw, attached to your front door." Torgrim said nothing. "If a man stacks supper against his door," Rook said, loud enough for the 4 other men in the store to hear, "he ought not complain when the livestock come visiting." Laughter. Not cruel laughter. Not yet. The laughter of men who have heard something odd and are waiting to see if it gets odder. Rook leaned forward. The smile left. "I will make you an offer, Asen. $60 for your claim. That is more than fair for a quarter section with a half-finished cabin and a dead wife's grave on it. Take your children to town. Widow Hansen will board them. You can work freighting for me until spring and start over somewhere. The wind does not eat you alive." "The claim is not for sale." "Not today." Rook straightened. "Come January, you will sell it for 40. Come February for 20. Come March, the county will sell it for back taxes, and I will buy it for 10. He picked up his hat. "Build your straw palace. I will bring the matches when you need heat." He walked out. The 4 men watched Torgrim. Torgrim picked up the wire he had come for, left 2 dimes on the counter, and walked out the other way. The gossip began that afternoon. Torgrim heard it secondhand from Warren Plum's wife, Ada, who had heard it from the storekeeper's wife, who had heard it from Rook's driver. The widower north of town was building a straw hallway on his front door. He was burning through bedding material for some Norwegian notion. He was not in his right mind. The children would be safer with relatives. Someone should speak to the county. Torgrim heard this and kept making bales. Bale 29, bale 30. The wire bit his palms. His back screamed. The straw pile shrank. November pressed forward, and the first hard freeze was 2 weeks away at most. The first wall went up on the 18th of November, and it fell down on the 19th. Torgrim had laid 8 bales in a line extending west from the cabin door, stacking them too high and too deep on the north side of what would become the tunnel's first straight section. He had pinned them with willow rods driven vertically through the top bale and into the bottom, a technique he invented on the spot and trusted because the rods felt tight when he shoved them. Overnight, the temperature dropped below freezing. Moisture in the ground beneath the bales froze, expanded, and tilted the base course. The bottom bales wicked frost melt from the earth and softened along their lower edges. By morning, the north wall leaned 6 inches out of plumb. By noon, when a gust hit from the northwest, the whole section slumped like a man sitting down slowly. 12 bales ruined. Their bindings popped, their straw splayed, the willow rods sticking out at angles like broken bones. Torgrim stood in the debris and felt something worse than cold. He felt stupid. He felt the way Warren Plum expected him to feel. He felt the way Alva Rook wanted him to feel. He felt like a man who had gambled the last of his time on an idea drawn in charcoal on the back of an envelope, and the idea had collapsed in less than a day. Maren came out of the cabin and looked at the wreckage. She was 9. She did not say anything encouraging. She said, "Are you going to fix it, or are we going to town?" Torgrim did not answer. He started pulling apart the ruined bales, separating wet straw from dry, saving the wire, stacking the willow rods. His fingers were numb. The wind cut through his coat. He worked until dark and made 6 replacement bales from the salvaged straw, smaller and uglier than the originals. He did not know how to keep the base from wicking water. He did not know how to make the walls resist wind. He knew the principle: stop the wind, slow the cold. But the principle was a candle on a table, and the reality was 800 pounds of wet straw lying in the dirt. That night, Maren coughed for an hour. The stove ate 3 chips and a quarter-cord log just to keep the cabin above shivering. Torgrim opened the door twice for fuel and once for water. Each time the snow line appeared on the floor. Each time the stove labored to recover. Each time the arithmetic got worse. He was losing. And then, on the morning of the 20th, Marit Tveit walked up the draw, carrying a sack of turnips and a coil of straw rope, and everything changed. Marit was 62 years old. She had been born in Hardanger, Norway, had come to Nebraska with her husband Elling in 1873, had buried Elling after a horse kicked him in 1881, and had survived alone on her quarter section ever since, by knowing more about more things than any man in the district would publicly admit. She was a dairy woman, a midwife, a thatcher, and a woman who had once repaired a broken wagon axle with rawhide and elm bark, while the freighter who owned it stood watching with his mouth open. She did not come because she pitied Torgrim. She came because Ada Plum had mentioned the straw tunnel at the quilting circle, and Ada had mentioned it as a joke, and Marit had not laughed. She came because she had seen the miniature smoke test on Torgrim's crate lid. Ada had described it while miming Torgrim blowing on a candle, and she understood immediately what he was trying to do. She found him on his knees in the dirt, cutting apart the ruined bales with a hay knife. Marit set the turnips on the ground. She looked at the collapsed wall section. She looked at the cabin door. She looked at the remaining straw pile. She looked at the gap between the first standing bales and the cabin's west wall. She crouched beside one of the fallen base bales and pressed her thumb into the bottom edge. The straw was dark with moisture. You set them on the ground, she said. Yes. The ground is wet. I know that now. Straw drinks. She stood and wiped her hands on her apron. Your father never taught you to raise a base course? Torgrim went still. My father taught me about sheep barns. And what did the sheep barn sit on? He thought about it. The telemark barn. The entry passage with its 2 turns. He had remembered the turns. He had remembered the thick walls. He had not remembered the stone foundation, flat rocks laid beneath the first course of timber and turf to keep the organic material off the damp earth. Stone, he said. Stone, or sod blocks, anything that does not drink. Marit pointed at the sod wall of the cabin. You have sod. You have flat stones in the creek bed. Lift your first course off the ground, and the ground cannot ruin it. This was not charity. This was a woman who recognized a sound idea built on a poor foundation and who had no patience for watching good thinking fail for stupid reasons. She did not offer to help. She pointed at the creek bed and said, The flat one's near the east bank. Bring 8. Torgrim brought 8 flat stones. Marit showed him how to lay sod blocks between them to create a continuous raised base, plus 6 inches off the ground, along the entire length of the tunnel footprint. The straw bales would sit on this base, lifted above the frost line, separated from the moisture that had destroyed his first attempt. They worked together for 3 hours that first morning. Marit did not lecture. She demonstrated. When the base course was laid, she knelt on the first bale, while Torgrim cinched the baling wire tighter, compressing the straw until the bale was dense enough that she could not push her finger into it. A tight bale does not sag, she said. A loose bale is a pile, not a wall. She showed him how to stagger the bales like brickwork, so the seams did not align. She showed him how to drive willow rods at a diagonal through 3 courses instead of straight down through 2, creating a pin that resisted lateral wind force. She showed him how to twist straw rope and thread it through the bales horizontally, tying adjacent bales together so the wall acted as a unit rather than a stack of individuals. By midday, 6 feet of tunnel wall stood on the new base. It did not lean. It did not wobble when Torgrim pushed it. The wind hit it and went around. Marit looked at the standing wall with the expression of a woman who is satisfied but not finished. Tomorrow, she said, I will show you how to seal the seams. A crack is a whistle. A whistle is heat leaving. She picked up her sack, minus the turnips, which she left on Torgrim's table, and walked back down the draw. Torgrim watched her go. He looked at the 6 feet of wall. He looked at the cabin door. He looked at the remaining straw pile, which still held enough material for 80 bales if he packed them tight. For the first time since Guro died, the arithmetic did not end at 0. The wall stood. The wind went around it. And tomorrow, a woman who understood straw and stone and the patience required to make one serve as the other was coming back to teach him more. But 20 feet of tunnel remained unbuilt. The first hard freeze was 12 days away. Alva Rook was watching from town with a ledger book and a surveyor's map. And Torgrim Asen had not yet faced anything close to the worst that this winter had planned. The stove ticked, the wind pressed, the wall waited, and somewhere to the northwest, weather was building that would make everything he had done so far look like a man stacking bales against a whisper. Marit returned the next morning before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. She brought a bucket of clay she had dug from the creek bank on her own property, a sack of dried cow dung, and a handful of chopped straw shorter than her little finger. She mixed these on a flat stone beside the tunnel footprint, adding water from Torgrim's well until the mixture reached a consistency She tested by squeezing a fistful and watching it hold its shape without crumbling. Daubing, she said, every seam, every gap where one bale meets another, every place where you can see light through the wall. She pressed a handful into the joint between two bales and smoothed it with the heel of her palm. You are not making it pretty. You are making it quiet. When the wind stops whistling through your wall is finished. Torgrim worked beside her. The daubing was slow, ugly labor, hands cracking from the dung and clay mixture, knuckles raw from pressing into rough straw, fingernails packed with grit that would not wash out. Each seam took 3 or 4 passes. Each pass meant kneeling in dirt that was already freezing, reaching overhead to seal the top joints, crouching to pack the base where the bales met the sod blocks. Marin brought water when the bucket ran low. Bastian sat on a flat stone and packed mud into the gaps near the ground with a wooden spoon, his small hands black to the wrists. He said the wall smelled like the cowshed. He was not wrong. By the end of that second day with Marit, the first 6 feet of tunnel were daubed tight. Marit lit a candle inside the passage and walked outside. She put her mouth to the wall and blew. The flame inside trembled, but held. Good, she said. Not perfect. Good enough for straw. On the 3rd day, she taught Torgrim the fire rule. No lantern left in the tunnel. No loose straw within arm's reach of the stove wall. No pipe contact. The stovepipe must clear the tunnel roof by at least 2 feet, which meant the pipe would exit through the cabin's existing roof hole, not through the tunnel. If a spark landed on a straw bale wall, the tunnel would burn in minutes. If the tunnel burned while the family was inside, the family burned with it. Your tunnel saves heat, Marit said. It does not forgive stupidity. She made Torgrim repeat the rules while she watched. Then she made Marin repeat them. She did not make Bastian repeat them because Bastian was 5, but she crouched in front of him and said, "No fire in the long hallway. Never. You understand?" Bastian nodded with the gravity of a child who has been spoken to as a person. That night, Torgrim asked Marit how she knew about building with straw. She was pulling on her coat to walk home in the dark, and she stopped with one arm in the sleeve. "Elling and I had no timber our first winter," she said. 1873. We dug into a hillside and stacked straw bales across the opening. It was not a tunnel, it was a wall with a door in it, but the straw held the air still, and the hillside held the straw, and we lived. She put her other arm through the sleeve. Elling said it was temporary. We used it 4 winters. She left. Torgrim stared at the cabin door and tried to imagine Marit at 30, digging into a frozen hillside with a husband who would be dead in 8 years. The image settled into him the way her lesson settled, not as information, but as proof that the principle worked when tested by someone who had no other choice. Progress came in stages, each one earned. By November 25th, the first straight section, 8 feet of tunnel extending due west from the cabin door, stood solid. Torgrim had used 31 bales, 9 willow poles, 42 willow rods, and enough daubing to empty the creek bank clay deposit twice. The walls were 2 bales thick on the north side, where the prevailing winter wind struck, and 1.5 bales on the south side, where the wind pressure was lower. Marit had questioned the thinner south wall. Torgrim had calculated the straw supply and told her he could not afford too deep on both sides and still have enough for the dog legs. "Then you will feel the difference," she said. She was not arguing. She was noting. The distinction between a perfect tunnel and a possible tunnel was a distinction Torgrim could not afford to ignore. The first dogleg winddrain, the leftward turn at 8 feet, took 4 days of work that nearly broke him. Turning a straw bale wall required cutting bales at angles, bracing the corner with doubled willow stakes and packing the joint so tightly that no crack survived. The corner wanted to sag outward under its own weight. Torgrim rebuilt it 3 times before Marit showed him to brace the outer edge with sod blocks stacked like a buttress. The sod was heavy, frozen, and required the pickaxe he had avoided using because each swing sent a shock through his shoulders that lasted until morning. Marin helped carry sod blocks. She was 9, and she carried blocks that weighed 15 pounds each, walking the 60 feet from the digging site to the tunnel corner with the careful, flat-footed gait of someone carrying something that might break. She did not complain. She did not ask why. She had heard the arithmetic. She knew what 1 cord and 3/4 meant, even if she did not yet understand the physics of why straw might change the answer. By November 30th, the first dogleg was complete. 12 feet of tunnel stood, straight section and first turn. The second straight section, angling slightly south, would run another 4 feet before the second dogleg turned the passage back toward the west. Then a final 4 feet to the outer door, 20 feet total. The weather had been cooperating. November had been cold but not killing, nighttime temperatures dropping to 10 above, daytime rising to 25 or 30. This was building weather. This was not testing weather. The real cold had not arrived, and everyone knew it. Ephraim Dace came back on December 2nd. He rode the same dun mare. He did not bring cornmeal this time. He came because the word had traveled. The Norwegian widower was still building his straw hallway, and now the Tveit widow was helping him, which meant either 2 people had lost their senses or one of them knew something. Ephraim dismounted and walked the length of the standing tunnel without speaking. He ran his hand along the daubed surface. He crouched at the base and checked the sod block foundation. He looked at the corner bracing. He stepped inside the passage and stood in the first straight section where the walls rose above his head and the light came gray and filtered through the straw dust air. "It is tight," he admitted. He said it the way a man admits a horse is fast when he bet against it. "It will be tighter when it is finished," Torgrim said. "And the roof? Willow poles, straw bales on top, sod cap over that." Ephraim looked at the open top of the tunnel, where sky showed between the walls. "Your roof bales will sag between the poles. Snow will load them. The weight will push the walls out." Torgrim had not considered this. The realization hit him like a gust through an open door. Marit, who had been daubing the first dogleg's inner corner, straightened and said, "Scrap rafters, any board longer than 4 feet. Lay them across the poles before the bales go on. The bales rest on a flat surface, and the weight distributes." Ephraim looked at Marit. Marit looked back without deference. "You have done this before," Ephraim said. "I have survived before," Marit said. "The method is the same." Ephraim turned back to Torgrim. "I still say you need cordwood. This passage may slow the wind. It will not replace fuel. If January comes hard, you will burn through what you have, and this straw theater will not feed your stove." "It does not need to feed the stove," Torgrim said. "It needs to stop the door from emptying the cabin every time I open it." Ephraim considered this. He did not agree, but for the first time he did not dismiss it. He mounted his mare and said, "I will come back when the weather tests it. Fair days prove nothing." He rode off. Torgrim looked at Marit. Marit shrugged. "He is not wrong about the cordwood. He is wrong about the rest." The sabotage happened on the night of December 7th. Torgrim woke to Marin shaking his shoulder. "Something fell," she said. "Outside. Something big." He pulled on boots and coat and opened the cabin door into the tunnel. The first straight section was intact. He moved through it, ducking at the roof bales, feeling the walls with his hands in the dark. At the first dogleg, his foot hit something that should not have been on the ground, A bale, a full bale, fallen from the second course. He lit a match. The north wall of the second straight section, the section past the first turn, had partially collapsed. 4 bales had shifted outward and 2 had fallen. The willow rods that should have pinned them were gone, not broken, gone. The wire bindings on 3 bales had been cut. Torgrim held the match until it burned his fingers. He stood in the dark passage with fallen straw around his boots and understood that this was not weather and not poor construction. Someone had come in the night, pulled the willow pins, and cut the wires. He thought of Rook. He thought of Rook's hired driver, a man named Suttles who did what Rook told him and drank what Rook bought him. He thought of the planned road through the draws and the price of a homestead at tax sale. He could not prove it. He had no witness. He had no sheriff who would ride 14 miles to investigate cut wires on a straw wall that most of the county considered evidence of madness. He spent the 8th and 9th of December rebuilding the collapsed section. He used every remaining willow rod, drove them deeper, drove them at steeper angles, 3 rods per bale instead of 2. Marit came on the 9th and showed him a technique she had not yet shared. Diagonal stakes driven through 3 courses of bales at once, angled so that pulling one bale would tug against the stake's grip on the other 2. The wall became a locked grid instead of a stack. "Whoever did this," Marit said, without naming anyone, "will find it harder the next time." Torgrim lost 4 days of progress to the sabotage. 4 days he did not have. December was advancing. The second dogleg was still unbuilt. The outer door was still a plan. The roof was still open sky. He worked from first light to last dark. Marin held willow rods while he drove them. Bastian packed daubing into the rebuilt seams. Marit came every other day, bringing food she pretended was surplus: boiled turnips, salt pork, a jar of pickled beets, and corrections she did not pretend were anything but necessary. On December 14th, Ada Plum appeared at the tunnel's outer end with a bundle under her arm. She was Warren's wife, and Warren still thought the tunnel was foolishness, but Ada had seen Marin coughing at the store and had brought 6 rejected straw mats, floor mats her boys had outgrown, and said they might be useful for something. They were. Torgrim laid them inside the tunnel as floor covering, trapping a layer of dead air between the ground and the walking surface. The tunnel floor, which had been bare frozen earth, became insulated. Marit nodded when she saw the mats. "Every surface," she said. "Floor, walls, ceiling, dead air on every side." By December 20th, the tunnel was complete. It did not look like anything a man would be proud of. It looked like a crooked straw fort shoved against a poor man's door. The outer canvas and plank door hung at an angle because the frame was made from 3 different widths of scrap lumber. The mud daubing had frozen in ridges and whorls that caught the low winter light and made the walls look diseased. The sod cap on the roof was already sprouting dead grass from seeds that had survived the transplant. Snow had packed into the crevices between the sod pieces, creating white lines that made the whole structure look like a cracked egg. 20 feet long, 3 feet wide, 5.5 feet high, 2 dog legs, 2 doors, 87 bales of oat straw, 41 willow rods, 19 willow poles, 8 scrap rafters, 200 pounds of clay and dung daubing, 6 straw mats, and more hours of labor than Torgrim could count because he had stopped counting after the sabotage. But inside the passage, the air felt different. Torgrim noticed it on the first morning after completion. He opened the cabin door, the inner door, the original plank door, and stepped into the tunnel. The air was cold. It was December cold, well below freezing, but it was still. No wind, no horizontal pressure against his face and chest. No snow dust. No sound of the gale that was blowing outside, visible through the gaps at the outer door, but unable to navigate 2 turns and 20 feet of insulated passage to reach the cabin. He opened the outer door. Wind hit him. He closed it, walked the 20 feet to the inner door, and opened that. The lamp inside the cabin bent its flame slightly toward the door. It did not go flat. It did not gutter. Maren, sitting at the table with a reading primer Guro had brought from Norway, did not cough. The stove did not groan. The snow line did not appear on the floor. Torgrim closed the inner door, leaned against the tunnel wall, and pressed his palms to the straw. He could feel the bales absorbing his hand's warmth and holding it. The straw was dense, still, insulating in every direction. Between the outer door and the inner door, 2 turns broke the wind's path. The air in the passage was a buffer, colder than the cabin, warmer than the prairie, and moving nowhere. He began measuring. He had no proper thermometer for the tunnel itself, but he had one store-bought thermometer nailed to the wall near the stove, and he had Marit's method. Reading frost. Each morning, he checked the inside of the water bucket. Before the tunnel, the bucket frosted over within an hour of a door opening. After the tunnel, the bucket stayed liquid for 3 hours. Before the tunnel, the stove consumed a 1/4 cord log and 2 chips to recover from each door opening during a cold night. After the tunnel, the stove consumed 1 chip and held steady. Over 10 days, Torgrim burned 1 armload less fuel per day than he had in similar cold before the tunnel existed. 1 armload. That was a small number, but multiplied by 120 days of winter, it was 12 armloads. 12 armloads was nearly half a cord. Half a cord was the difference between running out in February and lasting until March. The tunnel did not make heat. It stopped heat from leaving. The distinction was everything. Ephraim Dace was not impressed. He came on December 28th, walked the tunnel, checked the thermometer, listened to Torgrim's armload calculations, and said, "A fair weather trick. You have had 10 days of ordinary cold. Wait for a northwester. Wait for wind, that means it." Warren Plum said the same thing differently. He stopped his horse and said, "Any wall helps in a mild freeze. Come back to me when it is 40 below and blowing and tell me your straw hallway held." Rook said it worse. He told the men at the store that the tunnel would draw rats by January and fire by February. He said the straw was rotting from the inside. He said the weight of the first real snow load would collapse the roof and block the door, trapping the family inside. He said these things with the careful precision of a man who wanted them repeated. The sky, meanwhile, was doing something unusual. Through the first week of January, 1888, temperatures remained moderate. Snow fell in light, manageable amounts. The wind blew but did not scream. Settlers who had braced for a killing January found themselves cautiously optimistic. Men traveled without scarves. Children walked to school without fear. Marit did not share the optimism. She came to Torgrim's cabin on January 10th and stood outside the tunnel's outer door, looking west at a sky that was too warm and too still. "This is wrong," she said. "Wrong how?" A warm day before deep cold is when people make fatal choices. They leave doors open. They let stoves burn low. They travel without thinking. She helped Torgrim hang a second blanket at the inner door. A wool blanket doubled over a willow rod, creating a third barrier between the tunnel air and the cabin air. "The tunnel will save heat. It will not save foolishness. Keep both doors closed. Keep the blanket down. Do not open the outer door without closing the inner one first." "I know," Torgrim said. "Knowing and doing are not the same thing when your hands are frozen and your son is crying," Marit said. She looked at him the way Halvor had looked at sheep barn walls, measuring what was solid and what was not. She left. Torgrim checked the woodpile. One cord and one armload remained of the original cottonwood, 7 sacks of chips. The tunnel had saved him nearly 3 weeks of fuel in its first month. If it held through the worst weather, he would make it to March. If it failed, if the roof collapsed under snow, if the walls buckled in a gale, if a spark found loose straw, he would burn through his remaining fuel in 10 days and face the choice Ephraim had described in November. Everything depended on a test that had not yet come. On January 11th, the temperature rose to 34 degrees above zero. Eaves dripped, snow softened. Warren Plum rode past Torgrim's cabin without a coat and said, grinning, "Looks like you wasted your autumn, Asen. Winter forgot to come." On January 12th, 1888, winter remembered. The morning was warm. Not January warm, genuinely, strangely warm, the kind of morning that made men stand in doorways and breathe without flinching. The sun came up diffused through a high haze that softened the light to the color of weak tea. Torgrim opened the outer tunnel door and felt air that did not cut. He almost smiled. By 10 o'clock, Maren was outside without her coat, helping Torgrim move straw scraps from the tunnel construction into the kindling pile. Bastian played near the well, building a fortress of ice chunks that were already melting. The world felt like a reprieve. It felt like mercy. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Torgrim looked west and stopped moving. The horizon had disappeared. Not gradually, not the way clouds build over hours and announce a storm with darkening stages. The entire western sky had become a wall, gray-white, dense, moving toward him at a speed he could see, actually see, the leading edge advancing across the prairie like a curtain drawn by a hand too large to comprehend. The temperature had already begun to drop. He could feel it on his face, the warmth peeling away as if the air itself was being pulled backward into the approaching front. He grabbed Bastian under one arm and shouted for Maren. She was 60 feet from the cabin near the straw pile. She turned, saw his face, and ran. The wind arrived before she reached the outer door. It did not build. It struck. One moment the air was still and 30 degrees above. The next moment a wall of wind hit the cabin with a sound like canvas tearing, and the temperature plunged so fast that the moisture on Torgrim's face froze before he could wipe it. Snow came horizontal, not falling, flying, and in the time it took Maren to cover the last 20 feet, visibility dropped to the length of his arm. He shoved Bastian through the outer door. Maren dove in after him. Torgrim pulled the plank and canvas door shut and lashed it with the rope he had fixed to the frame for exactly this purpose. The wind screamed against it. The canvas bulged inward. But the frame held, and the rope held, and the door held. Inside the tunnel, Torgrim stood with his children in the dark and listened. The wind was a continuous roar outside the outer door. He could hear it tearing at the sod cap, whistling through the spots where the daubing had cracked in the cold. But the sound diminished as he moved inward. By the first dogleg, the roar had become a moan. By the second dogleg, the moan had become a hum. By the inner door, the hum was barely audible beneath the ticking of the stovepipe. He opened the inner door. The lamp flame bent toward him, bent, not flattened. A soft pull of air, the tunnel exhaling as pressure equalized, and then the flame straightened. The stove was burning steady. The cabin air was cold because the stove had been banked while they worked outside, but it was not the killing cold that should have followed a door opening in a gale. No snow dust crossed the floor. No white line appeared. The cabin had not emptied itself. Maren looked at the lamp. She looked at the floor. She whispered, "It did not bite." Torgrim closed the inner door and knelt to feed the stove. His hands were shaking. not from cold, from the knowledge that the test had arrived without warning and the tunnel had not failed in the first 60 seconds. He loaded cottonwood splits and 2 chips. The stove drew cleanly. The pipe did not groan. Within 15 minutes, the cabin temperature was climbing. Outside, the world was ending. The storm that hit the Great Plains on January the 12th, 1888, arrived after a warm spell that had drawn people outdoors, sent children to school without winter clothing, and convinced settlers across Nebraska, Dakota Territory, and Minnesota that the worst was behind them. The temperature dropped more than 40 degrees in hours. Wind speeds turned snow into a blinding horizontal wall that reduced visibility to inches. The blizzard would later be called the Children's Blizzard because so many of the dead were school children caught in the open. Inside Torgrim's cabin, the stove burned. The lamp stayed lit. The children were alive. But the test was only beginning. Bastian's fever started at 4 o'clock. He had been damp when Torgrim carried him inside. His coat was wet from the melting ice he had been playing with, and in the rush to get through the tunnel, Torgrim had not stripped the wet clothing. An hour later, Bastian was shivering. An hour after that, his forehead was hot to the touch, and his eyes had the dull, inward look of a child whose body had turned its attention somewhere Torgrim could not follow. Maren pulled blankets from the bed. Torgrim moved Bastian to the warmest spot, the floor beside the stove, on a folded quilt, with 2 more quilts over him and a heated stone wrapped in cloth at his feet. The stone would cool. It would need reheating. The stove would need feeding. The cycle would demand attention through the night. And outside, a calf was bawling. Torgrim heard it through the tunnel, faint, barely audible over the storm, but persistent. The sound of a young animal lost in a blizzard, standing in wind that would freeze it dead before morning. The calf was part of his small herd, 4 head of cattle that represented next summer's trade goods, next autumn's meat, next year's plow team. Losing one meant losing a quarter of his livelihood. He looked at Bastian. He looked at the cabin door. He looked at Maren, who was 9 years old and who understood exactly what the choice was. "I will be fast," he said. He opened the inner door, stepped into the tunnel, closed the inner door behind him, walked the 20 feet to the outer door, and braced himself. The blanket at the inner door hung still. He opened the outer door. The wind nearly took him off his feet. Snow packed into the tunnel mouth in a solid wedge. He pushed through it, head down, and stepped into nothing. There was no visibility. There was no sky. There was only white moving sideways at a speed that tore breath from his mouth and drove ice crystals into his eyes until he could not open them. He found the calf by sound. 23 steps from the tunnel mouth, roped to a stake that had come loose from the frozen ground, the animal standing head down in a drift that reached its belly. Torgrim grabbed the rope, pulled the calf forward, and dragged it toward the tunnel. He could not see the tunnel. He navigated by memory and by the wind direction. The tunnel mouth faced west. The wind came from the northwest, so he angled left until his shoulder hit the straw wall. He shoved the calf into the tunnel mouth. It did not want to go. He wrestled it through the outer door and lashed the door shut with the calf standing in the first straight section of the passage, bawling, steaming, alive. There was not room in the tunnel for the calf to reach the inner door. It would stay in the first section between the outer door and the first dogleg, where the air was cold enough to keep it from overheating, but sheltered enough to keep it from freezing. The calf's body heat would add a few degrees to the tunnel air. Marit would have approved. He moved past the calf, through the first dogleg, through the second straight section, through the second dogleg, and reached the inner door. He opened it. The lamp flame bent only. The stove was burning. Bastian was coughing, but alive. The cabin had not lost its warmth. In a cabin without the tunnel, that trip would have cost 20 minutes of stove recovery. The door would have been open for the full duration of his struggle with the calf. Wind would have entered in a continuous blast, dropping the cabin temperature to near outdoor levels, and the stove, already working to keep a sick child warm, would have fought for an hour to rebuild what the open door destroyed. Instead, Torgrim had opened the inner door for 4 seconds on the way out and 3 seconds on the way back. The tunnel had held the gap. He stripped his wet coat, reheated the stone for Bastion, fed the stove, and sat on the floor beside his children. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and wet wool and the faint sweetness of straw from the tunnel. The wind roared outside the walls, but the roar was muffled by 20 feet of packed oat straw and 2 turns that the wind could not navigate. At 9 o'clock that night, someone pounded on the outer tunnel door. The pounding was not wind. Wind does not knock in rhythm. Torgrim moved through the tunnel in the dark, past the calf that had lain down and was breathing steam, and pressed his ear to the outer door. The pounding came again. A voice beneath it, thin and torn by wind, but human. He untied the rope and pulled the door inward against the gale. Snow and wind and a woman fell into the tunnel mouth. Ada Plum, Warren's wife. She had the youngest Plum boy, Orrin, 7 years old, under her arm like a sack of grain. Orrin was not moving. Ada's face was white where it was not red, and her shawl was frozen stiff enough that it cracked when Torgrim pulled it away from her shoulders. "Warren went for the schoolhouse," Ada said. Her voice was flat with cold. "He went to get the other boys. He has not come back." Torgrim pulled them into the tunnel and closed the outer door. He did not bring them directly into the cabin. He did what Marit had taught without Marit ever saying these exact words. He held them in the passage. Outer door closed, inner door still closed. The tunnel air was cold, but it was not wind cold. Torgrim stripped the frozen shawl, pulled off Orrin's ice-caked boots, and rubbed the boy's hands between his own until Orrin made a sound that was not a word, but was alive. Then he opened the inner door, brought them into the cabin, and closed the door behind them. The lamp flame bent and recovered. The stove kept its draw. 4 people and a calf now depended on the tunnel, and the tunnel held. Ada sat on the floor beside Bastion and pressed Orrin against her body. Marin brought the last quilt. Torgrim fed the stove. The cabin held 6 bodies' worth of heat. Torgrim, Marin, Bastion, Ada, Orrin, and the calf in the passage contributing its animal warmth through the inner door, and the stove burned steady because the tunnel had stopped every door opening from becoming a catastrophe. The night continued. Torgrim went out through the tunnel 3 more times, twice for fuel, once to check the remaining cattle. Each time he closed the inner door before opening the outer. Each time the cabin held its warmth. Each time the recovery was measured in seconds, not the 20 minutes Ephraim had calculated in November. By midnight, the wind had not slowed. The temperature outside had dropped to at least 25 below by the reading of a thermometer Ephraim had once nailed to a fence post at the road. A thermometer Torgrim would check in the morning and find frozen at its lowest mark. Inside the cabin, the temperature held above 40. Not warm, not comfortable, but the children were alive and the stove was burning and the woodpile beside the south wall had lost only 3 splits and a handful of chips since the storm began. At 2 in the morning, Bastion's fever broke. He opened his eyes, looked at Orrin sleeping beside him, and said, "Who is that?" "A neighbor," Torgrim said. "Is it still storming?" "Yes." "The hallway is loud," Bastion said. He meant the tunnel. The wind moaned through it, the sound of air fighting 2 turns and losing, but the cabin side of the inner door was quiet. "Go back to sleep," Torgrim said. Bastian closed his eyes. Marin, lying beside him, was already asleep. Ada sat against the wall with Oren in her lap, her eyes open, staring at the stove as if it might vanish. "How is this cabin still warm?" Ada asked. "The tunnel. The straw tunnel. Warren said it was foolishness." Torgrim did not answer. There was nothing to say about what Warren said. Warren was somewhere in the storm, and whether he had reached the schoolhouse or not, no one in this cabin would know until morning. Meanwhile, in cabins without vestibules, the night was different. Warren Plum's cabin, a mile and a half south, had a standard plank door facing east. Each time a searcher opened it, and searchers came twice that night, looking for Warren. The cabin emptied its warmth in a rush that drove Warren's remaining son into the corner farthest from the door with every blanket the family owned. The stove burned through a full cord between dusk and dawn. Ephraim Dace, who had ridden to check on settlers along the road, found one of Rook's hired freight hands collapsed in a haystack 300 yards from Rook's freight shed. The man was alive, but his left hand and both feet were black with frostbite. Rook's freight shed door had frozen open when the latch mechanism jammed, and the stove inside a large box stove meant to heat a space 4 times the size of Torgrim's cabin, could not keep the temperature above freezing with the door gaping. The contrast was not subtle. It was not a minor difference in comfort. It was the difference between a cabin that held its heat through the worst night in a generation and cabins that hemorrhaged warmth every time a door opened. At dawn on January 13th, the wind began to die. Not quickly, it took hours to pass from screaming to moaning to a low, exhausted whisper, but the change was real. Torgrim opened the outer tunnel door at first light and stepped into a world remade. Snow had drifted to the roofline on the cabin's west side. The tunnel's outer wall was packed with a drift that actually reinforced the straw bales, pressing them tighter against the willow stakes. The sod cap on the tunnel roof held a foot of snow that had frozen into a solid shell. The tunnel had not collapsed. It had not torn loose. It had not burned. It had not attracted rats. It had done exactly what Torgrim designed it to do. It had made the door survivable. He checked the woodpile. The arithmetic was clear. In a night that should have consumed half a quart of cottonwood and a full sack of chips, the rate Ephraim's experience predicted for a night of repeated door openings in a killing blizzard. Torgrim had burned 3 cottonwood splits and 6 chips, less than half what should have been required, less than a third of what Warren's cabin had consumed in the same hours. Marin stood in the tunnel behind him. She looked at the white world outside and then at the straw walls on either side of her, daubed with clay and dung, braced with willow, ugly and solid and standing. "It worked," she said. "It worked." But Warren Plum was still missing, and the world outside the tunnel was a graveyard of snow and silence that would take days to reveal what it had buried. Warren Plum was found on the morning of January 14th in the cellar beneath the schoolhouse, alive, curled around his 2 older boys with his coat spread over them and his boots off because he had used his socks to wrap their hands. His fingers were white when the search party pulled him out, the left hand worse than the right. And the doctor in Broken Bow would later take 2 fingertips from that left hand with a saw and a bottle of whiskey. But Warren was alive. His boys were alive. The school teacher, a woman named Olive Kittredge, had herded 11 children into the cellar when the storm hit and kept them there for 16 hours by burning desk legs and reading primers aloud until her voice gave out. The blizzard killed more than 200 people across the plains. Many were children caught between school and home. The count would grow as spring revealed what the drifts had buried. Torgrim heard the number and held Marin and Bastian until they squirmed. Ephraim Dace came on the 16th of January. He rode the dun mare through drifts that reached the animal's chest and arrived at the tunnel's outer door with frost on his beard and no speech prepared. He had expected to find ashes or a collapsed straw wall, or at best a family huddled around a stove that had consumed the last of their fuel during the worst night any of them had lived through. What he found was a cabin that smelled of coffee and wood smoke. 6 people, Torgrim, Marin, Bastian, Ada, Orin, and a hired girl from a neighboring claim who had taken shelter during the storm's second day, sat around the table eating corn porridge. The stove burned steady. The lamp was lit. The water bucket was not frozen. Ephraim walked through the tunnel slowly. He touched the walls. He crouched at the first dogleg and put his hand flat against the straw, the way Torgrim's father had pressed his palm to the sheep barn wall in Telemark. The straw was cold but not frozen. The daubing had held. The willow stakes had not shifted. The sod cap on the roof carried 2 feet of compacted snow that had frozen into an additional layer of insulation, and the roof bales beneath it had not sagged because the scrap rafters distributed the load exactly as Marit had said they would. Ephraim came back inside the cabin and looked at the wood pile through the window. He did not ask permission. He went outside, walked to the south wall, and counted. When he came back in, he stood by the stove for a long time. "I told you 6 cords," he said. Torgrim said nothing. "You have burned." Ephraim paused. He was a man who did not make mistakes with numbers, and he was recalculating in his head, checking his count against what he knew Torgrim had started with. "You have burned less than 3/4 of a cord since November, including the blizzard night." "Closer to 2/3, Torgrim said. Ephraim looked at the tunnel entrance, the inner door with its wool blanket hanging on the willow rod. He looked at the stove with its cracked collar. He looked at the children. He looked at the woodpile number in his head, and the calendar in his head, and the rate of burn in his head, and the arithmetic changed him before his pride could stop it. "You may yet get through with 3, Ephraim said. It was the closest thing to an apology his voice could produce. The room was quiet. Ada Plum looked at Torgrim and then at the tunnel door. She had spent 4 days in this cabin. She had watched Torgrim open the outer door in a blizzard and close the inner door first. She had watched the lamp flame bend and recover instead of dying. She had felt the difference between her own cabin, where every door opening was a crisis, and this cabin where the door was a process, outer, passage, inner, that cost seconds of heat instead of minutes. "Warren needs to see this," Ada said. "Warren saw it," Torgrim replied. "He said I wasted my autumn." "Warren said that before he lost his fingers." Warren Plum came on January 22nd, 8 days after they pulled him from the schoolhouse cellar. His left hand was bandaged. 2 fingertips were gone. He walked the tunnel the way Ephraim had, slowly touching the walls, stopping at each dogleg to feel the change in air movement. He stood at the outer door and opened it. Wind entered. He closed it and walked back to the inner door. By the time he reached the cabin threshold, the wind was a memory. He did not praise Torgrim. He did not apologize for calling the tunnel foolishness. He stood in the passage between the second dogleg and the inner door, his bandaged hand against the straw wall, and asked a question. "How wide did you leave the inside?" 3 feet, Torgrim said. "And the turns, how sharp?" 90 degrees, full right angles. The wind cannot see around a corner." Warren nodded. He asked 4 more questions. The depth of the base, the number of bales per course, the thickness on the windward side, the type of daubing. He memorized the answers. He did not write them down because writing was difficult with 8 fingers. Then he left. That afternoon, Ada came back alone and asked Torgrim to help Warren build a shorter version, 12 feet, 1 turn, on their east-facing door before the next storm. The conversion was not a scene of gratitude. It was the sound of a practical man calculating new arithmetic with fewer fingers. Warren Plum would never say Torgrim was right. But he would build a straw entry on his cabin, and his boys would help, and the next storm would not find the Plum door undefended. Community members began arriving in the last week of January. They came pretending other errands, returning a borrowed saw, delivering a message from town, checking on the children after the blizzard, and they left having walked the tunnel with their hands on the walls and their minds running numbers. A man named Soren Espeland, who had a dugout 2 miles east, and a wife who was 7 months pregnant, asked how many bales he would need for a 6-foot entry. Torgrim told him 22 bales for a single turn, 14 if he kept it straight, but used a thick blanket door at the inner end. Soren nodded and asked where to find flat stones for the base. A widow named Clara Haugen, who lived alone on a quarter section south of the road and had survived the blizzard by nailing her door shut and not opening it for 2 days, asked whether the tunnel worked on a south-facing door. Torgrim said it worked on any door, but mattered most on the side that faced the prevailing wind. Clara said her door faced south. Torgrim said a single-turn entry would still help, because storm winds shifted, and any passage was better than bare plank. An older couple, the Lunds, came with their grandson and measured the tunnel with a knotted rope, noting dimensions at each course. Torgrim watched the old man count knots and said, 20 feet if you can spare it. Never straight if the wind faces the door. Raise the first course, daub every seam. Keep flame away, hang a second door. Marit was there that afternoon. She heard Torgrim explaining the daubing mixture and interrupted him. You are talking like a book, she said. Show them with smoke. She lit a candle, set it inside the tunnel at the first dogleg, and walked outside with Torgrim and the Lunds. She pointed at the flame visible through the passage. Blow, she told the old man. He blew at the tunnel mouth. Inside, the flame did not move. Now take away the turn, Marit said. She repositioned the candle in the straight section before the dogleg. Blow. The old man blew. The flame leaned. The turn is not decoration, Marit said. It is the wall inside the wall. The Lunds left with their knotted rope and a sack of Marit's daubing mixture. They built a 10-foot straw entry on their cabin before February and later told Ephraim Dace that their fuel consumption dropped by 1/3. Torgrim shared the design freely. He did not charge. He did not claim ownership. He explained the principle, stop the wind before it reaches the room, and gave measurements to anyone who asked. Some built long tunnels. Some built short ones. Some built only a straw baffle across their doorway, 2 bales thick, forcing visitors to step around it. Even that helped. The measurements told the story. By late February, Torgrim's household had burned less than half the wood Ephraim's 6-cord estimate demanded. The cabin had not been warm. Warm was a luxury that belonged to houses with proper walls and double stoves, but it had been survivable. Consistently, repeatedly, through storms that emptied other families' woodpiles and froze water buckets within arm's reach of the stove. The difference was not magic. It was not a perfect seal. It was the elimination of the single largest source of heat loss, the open door. Alva Rook reacted to the growing interest the way a man reacts when a river changes course away from his mill. He could not mock the tunnel anymore. The blizzard had proved it, and the arithmetic was public, so he attacked from a different angle. He told people at the store that the tunnel had survived only because the storm packed snow around it, and that any structure looks solid when the weather does the bracing. He told people the straw was rotting from the inside, that Torgrim's children would be breathing mold by spring. He told people the fire risk was irresponsible. None of these claims were baseless. Straw did rot in wet conditions. Fire was a real danger. The snowpack had reinforced the walls. Rook was not lying. He was selecting truths that served his purpose and arranging them into a case that sounded careful when it was calculated. Two families who had been considering straw entries hesitated. One man told Torgrim he would wait until spring to decide. Another said his wife would not allow straw against the house because of mice. Rook smiled when he heard this. He was not finished with Torgrim Asen. He was patient, and patience was cheaper than cordwood. Marit came every third or fourth day through February. The crisis was past, but the work was not. She and Torgrim fell into a rhythm that looked like friendship and functioned like apprenticeship. She taught. He refined. He built. She corrected. The tunnel, already complete, became a workshop for improvements. On February 8th, Marit showed Torgrim how to build a removable roof panel, a section of bales resting on a frame that could be lifted out for smoke inspection. If charring or heat damage occurred near the stove wall, the panel would reveal it without dismantling the roof. On February 15th, Torgrim devised an offset threshold at the outer door, a sod block laid across the bottom of the door frame, 6 inches high, that forced entering air upward as it crossed the threshold. Cold air hugged the ground. Lifting it even 6 inches disrupted its flow. Marit tested it with smoke and said nothing, which was her way of approving. On February 22nd, they argued. Torgrim wanted to slope the tunnel cap with additional sod so that meltwater would shed to the south side. Marit said the sod weight would exceed what the willow poles could bear, and that the meltwater should be channeled with a trench, not a slope. Torgrim said a trench would freeze and dam. Marit said a slope would shift the load and crack the daubing. They stood on opposite sides of the tunnel and spoke to each other with the clipped precision of people who respected each other too much to pretend agreement. They compromised. A shallow slope, 2 inches of rise over 20 feet, with a trench cut along the south base as backup. Both methods together. The argument was not about straw. It was about the gap between a man who thought in terms of structures and a woman who thought in terms of water. Together, they covered what neither would alone. The compromise held. When the March thaw came, meltwater ran off the shallow slope, and what remained drained into the trench. The daubing cracked in 2 places, but did not fail. Torgrim repaired the cracks with fresh mixture and said nothing to Marit about the slope working. Marit said nothing about the trench catching overflow. Neither needed to. In early March, Marit told Torgrim about Elling. Not the facts of Elling, Torgrim knew those. Dead in 1881, kicked by a horse, buried on the quarter section. Those were the details everyone knew. What Marit told him was the shape of the life before the death. They were sitting inside the tunnel during a mild afternoon, repairing a seam that had cracked during a cold snap. Marit had a flat stick she used to press daubing into gaps, and she worked with the same steady rhythm she brought to every task, and she said, without any particular introduction, Elling wanted to build a real house. Frame walls, glass windows. He talked about it every spring. Every spring I said we should wait another year, save another season's money, and then the horse kicked him, and he died in a sod house, and I stayed in it for 6 more years because I could not afford what he wanted, and I could not leave what he built. Torgrim did not say he understood, because saying you understand someone's grief is a way of making it smaller. He said, Guro wanted a lean-to on the west wall. I was going to build it in spring. They sat in the tunnel with the straw around them, and the March light coming gray through the outer door, and said nothing more about the dead. But the silence was not empty. It was the silence of 2 people who had each buried a life they expected to live and had continued building with whatever was left. That evening, Marit showed Torgrim one last technique. She took a piece of white muslin from her bag, flour sack fabric, thin and pale, and tacked it to the inner tunnel wall near the cabin door. The muslin reflected lamplight back into the passage, turning the darkest section of the tunnel from black to a dim gray that allowed navigation without a lantern. No fire risk, no flame in the straw passage, just cloth and reflected light. "This is the last thing I know about straw," Marit said. She said it with finality. On March 12th, Marit attended a birth at the Espelon dugout, 2 miles east. Soren Espelon's wife delivered a girl in the early hours of the morning while a late-season storm blew sleet against the dugout walls. Marit stayed through the birth, through the afterbirth, through the first feeding, and walked home in the storm because she did not want to burden a family with a new baby and a food supply already stretched thin. She developed a cough on March 15th. By March 20th, the cough had settled into her chest with a weight she recognized. She had seen this in other women her age, the kind of illness that arrives when the body has spent a winter working harder than it should, and the first warmth of spring loosens the grip the cold had kept on everything, including infection. Torgrim came to her cabin on March 22nd and found her in bed. The stove was burning. The cabin was warm. The illness was not warmth's enemy. "You should have sent for me," he said. "For what?" She coughed. "To build me a tunnel in my chest." He brought her water. He brought her broth that Marin had made from the last of the salt pork. He sat beside her bed and told her about the Lund family's fuel savings, about Soren Espeland's new entry, about Warren Plum's 12-foot single-turn passage that his boys had helped build. Marit listened. She said, "Do not let them make a secret of what hunger taught you." "I am not keeping secrets," Torgrim said. "I am giving measurements to anyone who asks." "Measurements are not enough. Show them why it works. Use smoke, use a candle, make them see the air." She closed her eyes. "Rook will try to sell it. He will make it wrong and sell it cheap, and someone will get hurt. When that happens, do not fight him with words. Fight him with a better version that people can build themselves." She died on March 28th, 1888. The cough had become pneumonia, and pneumonia in a 62-year-old woman who had spent the winter hauling clay and kneeling in frozen dirt was not a battle the body could win. Torgrim sat with her through the last night. Marin stayed with Bastian at the cabin. Ada Plum came at dawn and helped wash the body. They buried Marit on her own quarter section beside Elling, in soil that was just soft enough to dig because spring had begun its slow negotiation with the frozen ground. Torgrim walked home through the tunnel. He ducked through the first dogleg, where Marit had shown him to drive willow stakes diagonally through 3 courses. He passed through the second straight section, where she had taught him to read drafts with lamp smoke. He reached the inner door, where the white muslin she had tacked to the wall caught the gray light and turned darkness into something navigable. On the table inside the cabin, he found her straw needle, a long, curved tool she used for threading rope through bale seams, lying where she had left it on her last visit. He picked it up. It was smooth from decades of handling, the wood darkened by the oil of her hands, the point still sharp enough to pierce compressed straw without splitting the stalks. He set it on the shelf above the stove, where it would stay for years, next to Guro's reading primer and the charcoal drawing on the back of a torn envelope. The tunnel was quiet around him. Outside, the March wind pressed against the straw walls and could not enter. The stove ticked. The water bucket sat unfrozen. Somewhere in the passage, the calf, still sheltering in the first straight section where it had lived since the blizzard, shifted its weight and breathed. Marit had come because she recognized a sound idea built on a poor foundation. She stayed because the idea was worth her knowledge, and the man building it was worth her time. She left behind no patent, no published method, no record except in the hands of the people she had taught. The daubing mixture was hers, the diagonal stakes were hers, the smoke test, the raised base, the fire rules, the white muslin, hers. The tunnel stood because of Torgrim's labor and Merritt's knowledge, and now Torgrim carried both. The secondary crisis came in April, when the winter should have been finished but was not. On April 3rd, a wet snow driven by east wind struck the settlement with the particular viciousness of a season refusing to end. The snow was heavy, not the dry powder of January, but thick, saturated flakes that clung to every surface and accumulated at twice the rate. Roofs that had survived the blizzard sagged under the wet weight. Roads became impassable. The temperature hovered at freezing, which meant the snow did not blow away but sat, pressing down, soaking through. The schoolhouse, a frame building a mile and a half south, had 11 children inside and one teacher. Olive Kittredge, the same woman who had kept children alive in the cellar during the January blizzard, now faced a different problem. The school's coal scuttle held enough fuel for a normal day, not for a day when the door could not be opened without admitting a wall of wet snow that would soak the floor and drop the temperature. The chimney drafted poorly in east wind. The children were cold, and the afternoon was not half over. Olive had started a half-built straw baffle at the school entrance in February, after Torgrim had helped her stack 8 bales in an L shape around the front door. The baffle was incomplete. It had no roof, no daubing, and only one turn, but it broke the wind enough to make the door usable. The problem was the snow. Wet, heavy, it packed around the baffle's open top and seeped through the undaubed seams, saturating the straw and collapsing one section onto the ground. Word reached Torgrim through Soren Espeland's oldest boy, who had ridden to the schoolhouse that morning and ridden back when the storm made the road impassable. The boy arrived at Torgrim's cabin and said, "Miss Kittredge has 11 children and 6 hours of coal. The baffle is down." Torgrim looked at the tunnel. He looked at Maren. He thought about Marit, who was 4 days in the ground, and who had said, with the last clear words she spoke, "Do not let them make a secret of what hunger taught you." He rode to the schoolhouse. The ride took an hour in snow that reached his horse's belly. When he arrived, the schoolhouse was cold. Not dangerously cold, the stove still burned, but the children sat in coats, and the youngest had been crying. Olive Kittredge stood at the stove with red hands and the calm, controlled expression of a woman who is managing fear by refusing to show it. The collapsed baffle lay in a heap of wet straw beside the door. Torgrim dismounted and did not go inside. He stood in the snow and looked at the materials available. The surviving baffle bales, still intact on the south side. The schoolhouse desks, heavy oak with iron legs, straw mats from the floor, the canvas tarp that covered the woodshed behind the school, and rope from the bell tower. He did not have 20 feet of straw bales. He did not have sod blocks or flat stones or willow stakes or clay daubing. He had Marit's principles and whatever this building could give him. He built the temporary vestibule in 2 hours. He dragged 3 desks outside and arranged them in an L pattern extending from the door, their tops forming walls, their legs bracing against the ground. He stacked the surviving straw bales on the windward side, packing them against the desk legs and wedging them tight with wet snow that would freeze and hold. He draped the canvas tarp over the top, weighing it with snow and rope. He laid straw mats on the ground inside the passage. The inner end opened to the schoolhouse door. The outer end faced south, away from the east wind, with a blanket hung from a rope as a crude outer barrier. It was ugly. It was improvised. It was not a tunnel. It was a single-turn chamber, 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, with desk legs as framing and a canvas roof that would not last a week. But when Olive opened the schoolhouse door, the wind did not enter. The stove recovered in 30 seconds instead of 5 minutes. The children watched the blanket at the outer end flutter and the lamp flame inside hold steady, and they understood something without being told. Torgrim stayed until the storm passed. He fed the stove with desk legs from the 2 remaining spare desks, rationing each leg into thirds. Olive kept the children occupied with arithmetic problems, real arithmetic, the kind Torgrim understood. If the stove burns 1 desk leg every 2 hours, and we have 6 legs remaining, how many hours of heat do we have? The children calculated. 12 hours. The storm would have to end before midnight, or they would burn the reading shelf. The storm ended at 9 o'clock that evening. The children's parents arrived in a staggered procession of horses and wagons, and 1 man on foot who had walked 3 miles in the dark because his horse had thrown a shoe. Olive Kittredge stood at the schoolhouse door, the inner door, inside the improvised vestibule, and handed each child to a parent, and said nothing about the coal that had almost run out, or the moment at 4 in the afternoon when the last full scoop went into the stove and she had begun eyeing the bookshelf. Torgrim rode home in the dark. The April snow was already softening, the temperature rising above freezing as the front passed east. By morning, the schoolhouse vestibule would be sagging, the canvas tarp pooling with meltwater, the desk leg walls listing sideways. It did not matter. It had lasted long enough. He rode into the tunnel at his own cabin, dismounted inside the first straight section where the calf had lived during the blizzard, and stood in the dark passage with his hands on the straw walls. The walls were solid. The daubing was intact. The willow stakes held. Marit's work, and his, and Marin's, and Bastion's with his wooden spoon. He had built the schoolhouse vestibule alone, without Marit's hands, without her corrections, without her smoke test or her sharp voice cutting through his abstractions. He had used her principles, stop the wind, raise the base, make it turn, and adapted them to materials she had never imagined: oak desks, canvas tarps, frozen snow as mortar. The principles held because they were sound. The physics did not care whether the wall was straw or furniture. This was what Marit had meant, not the tunnel, the understanding. The understanding was the thing that could not rot or burn or be bought by a man with a freight wagon and a ledger book. Torgrim unsaddled his horse, walked through the tunnel to the cabin door, opened it, and found Marin and Bastion asleep by the stove with the lamp burning low. He closed the door. The flame bent and recovered. The stove ticked. The tunnel stood between his family and the dark. Outside, Alva Rook was already hearing about the schoolhouse. He was already thinking about what a straw vestibule kit might sell for. He was already wrong about what he was thinking, because what he planned to sell was a shape, and what Torgrim had built was a principle, but that confrontation belonged to the weeks ahead. For now, the tunnel held. The children slept. The stove burned. And the man who had drawn a crooked passage on the back of a torn envelope sat at his table in a cabin that had survived the worst winter in memory and counted the wood remaining in the pile. Enough for April, enough for the mud month when the prairie turned to soup and the last cold snaps arrived like guests who refused to leave. Enough. For the first time since Guro died, the word meant something, but enough was a number, not a fortress. Rook was circling. The settlement was watching. The tunnel had proved itself to this family. Whether it could survive being copied, cheapened, and sold by a man who understood commerce and nothing else, that was a test the straw had not yet faced. Rook moved fast. By the second week of April, before the last snow had finished melting, He had hired a man in Broken Bow to cut straw bales to a standard size, smaller than Torgrim's, lighter, cheaper to transport, and had begun advertising what he called Rook's Prairie Heat Saving Entry at the general store. The advertisement was a hand-lettered card tacked to the wall beside the coffee tins. Pre-cut straw bales, willow framing, and a canvas door delivered to your homestead for $6. Assembly instructions included. The price was calculated. $6 was less than a cord of winter-rate firewood. For a family that had watched neighbors survive the blizzard with less fuel, $6 sounded like insurance. Rook sold 3 kits in the first week. Torgrim heard about the kits from Soren Espeland, who had come to ask about reinforcing his own tunnel's roof against spring melt. Soren described the kits with the puzzled expression of a man who has seen a tool redesigned by someone who does not understand what the tool does. "The bales are half the size of yours," Soren said. "1 bale thick on every side. No sod base, no daubing included. The instructions say to build it straight, no turns." Torgrim set down the straw needle, Marit's needle, which he now used for all his seam work, and was quiet for a moment. "Straight," he repeated. "Straight. 8 feet long, straight out from the door. 2 doors, inner and outer. That is all." A straight passage did 2 things wrong. First, it allowed wind a clear path from the outer door to the inner door, reducing the airlock effect to nothing more than a second door with a hallway between them. The turn was not decoration. The turn was the mechanism. Without it, the passage was a funnel, not a baffle. Second, a single bale-thick wall in a straight configuration would take the full force of any cross-wind along its length, and without daubing to seal the seams, wind would whistle through the gaps and enter the cabin nearly as fast as through an open door. Rook was selling a shape. He was selling the appearance of Torgrim's tunnel without the principles that made it work. The sod base was missing, so the bales would wick moisture and rot. The daubing was absent, so every seam would leak. The turn was eliminated, so the wind would not lose its force. The bales were thin, so the insulating mass was halved. It would collapse in the first wet snow, or it would stand and fail to perform, and the families who bought it would conclude that the straw entry idea itself was fraudulent, and Rook would have poisoned the method by selling a broken version. Marit's voice came back to Torgrim as clearly as if she were standing in the tunnel beside him. "When that happens, do not fight him with words. Fight him with a better version that people can build themselves." Torgrim did not go to the store. He did not confront Rook. He did not write a letter or make a speech. He started building. The community build happened on a Saturday in late April after the roads dried enough to allow wagons. Torgrim had spent 2 weeks preparing, cutting bales, stockpiling daubing mixture, splitting willow stakes, gathering flat stones from the creek, and had sent word through Ada Plum and Soren Espeland that he would help any family build a proper straw entry for the cost of materials only, which was nothing, because every homestead had straw, clay, dung, and willows. 3 families came the first Saturday: the Haugen widow with her son-in-law, the Lunds with their grandson, a young couple named Flatten who had arrived in the fall and survived the blizzard in a dugout so poorly ventilated that they had burned through their entire fuel supply and spent the last 3 days of January in bed under every piece of fabric they owned. Torgrim organized the work the way Marit had organized him, by principles, not instructions. He did not say stack the bales here. He said, "Where does your wind come from?" and made each family answer before he helped them plan. He did not daub their seams for them. He mixed the daubing, showed them the consistency, and put the flat stick in their hands. He did not drive the willow stakes. He showed the angle down 45 degrees through 3 courses and let them drive. Marn worked alongside the builders. She was 9, and she carried bales, held stakes, and packed daubing with the efficiency of a child who had learned by doing and did not understand that children were supposed to watch. Bastian, 6 now and healthy, mixed mud with his hands and told the Flatten boy, who was 4, that the walls should smell like the cowshed when it was done right. By the end of the first Saturday, 3 entries stood in various stages of completion. None was 20 feet. The Hogan entry was 12 feet with 1 turn. The Lund entry was 10 feet with 1 turn. The Flatten entry was 8 feet with a single dog leg and a blanket door because they could not afford canvas. All 3 had raised bases. All 3 had daubed seams. All 3 turned. The second Saturday, 2 more families came. The third Saturday, 4. By mid-May, 9 homesteads in the district had some form of straw entry, baffle, or bent passage at their doors. Not all were tunnels. Some were short. Some were crude. One was built against a barn door instead of a cabin. But all of them turned, and all of them sat on raised bases, and all of them had daubed seams. The principle held regardless of scale. Torgrim began marking fuel consumption on a cabin beam with a hatchet. 1 notch per armload of wood burned. The notches marched along the beam in a line that he could read like a calendar. November's notches were dense, 3 and 4 per day before the tunnel. December's were fewer. January's, despite the blizzard, were fewer still. February and March showed the clearest pattern. 1 notch per day on most days, 2 on the coldest. The beam was a record that could not be argued with. Anyone who entered the cabin could count the notches and see what the tunnel had done. Ephraim Dace saw the beam on a visit in May. He stood in front of it for a long time, counting under his breath, and then he did something Torgrim had not expected. He took out a pencil and copied the notch pattern onto a piece of paper. "For my winter advice," he said, "I have been telling people 6 chords. I may need to tell them something else." This was not conversion. This was incorporation. Ephraim Dace, the authority skeptic who had walked Torgrim's property in November and declared the situation fatal, was adding windbreak at the door to the same list that included cordwood, chips, and water. The tunnel had not replaced his expertise. It had expanded it. Rook's kit failed on the 9th of May. A family named Gunderson, 4 miles north, had bought one of Rook's $6 entries and assembled it according to the printed instructions. 8 feet straight, single bale walls, no base, no daubing, canvas doors at both ends. It looked clean and professional. Rook's hired man had cut the bales to uniform size, and the canvas was new, and it stood for 3 weeks without incident because 3 weeks of dry, moderate weather do not test a structure. On the 9th of May, a late-season wet snow hit the district. Not a blizzard, a heavy, soaking snowfall with mild wind and temperatures hovering at freezing, the kind of weather that the January tunnel had survived without notice. The Gunderson entry absorbed water through its undaubed seams, swelled unevenly because the bales sat directly on wet ground, and collapsed inward at 3 in the morning when the saturated weight exceeded the unsupported wall's capacity to stand. No one was inside the passage when it fell. No one was hurt, but the Gunderson family lost their outer door, crushed under the falling bales, and spent the rest of the night with a single plank door between them and the storm. Their stove consumed 2 days' worth of fuel in 8 hours. The word spread quickly, the way failure always spreads faster than success. Rook's entry collapsed. Rook's bales rotted. Rook sold people a wall that fell down. Warren Plum, 8-fingered, grudging, practical Warren Plum, said the sentence that ended Rook's straw business. He said it at the general store, in front of 6 men and the storekeeper, with Rook standing 4 feet away. "Asen told you it had to turn," Warren said. "You sold them a chimney for wind." The silence in the store lasted long enough for Rook to feel every set of eyes. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He picked up his hat from the counter and walked out. The $6 kits disappeared from the advertisement card that afternoon. Rook's full reckoning came not in public, but in private, and it came in October 1888, 10 months after the blizzard. The planned road through the draws had been surveyed and approved, but the route had shifted a quarter-mile south of Torgrim's claim, following the contour that the county engineer preferred. Rook's interest in Torgrim's land, the hidden stake that had fueled his mockery, his sabotage, his $6 kits, was now worth nothing. The road would not cross Torgrim's property. The claim had no special value to a freight agent. The game was over, and Rook had lost it to a surveyor's line. He came to Torgrim's cabin on an afternoon in late October. He came alone, without his hired man, without his smile. He stood outside the tunnel's outer door and waited until Torgrim came out. "I hold your store note," Rook said. $11.40. "I know what I owe," Torgrim said. Rook reached into his coat and brought out the folded paper. He held it between two fingers, the way a man holds something he does not want to touch. "I'm returning this." Torgrim did not take it. "Why?" "Because I mispriced straw." The two men stood in the October wind, which was cool and steady and pressing against the tunnel wall without effect. Torgrim looked at the note. He looked at Rook, whose face held the expression of a man performing surgery on his own pride without anesthesia. "No," Torgrim said. "You mispriced listening." Rook set the note on the flat stone beside the outer door. He turned and walked to his horse. He mounted, rode to the road, and did not look back. The note sat on the stone, edges lifting in the wind until Marin came out and brought it inside. That was the last time Alva Rook came to Torgrim's property. He continued to sell cordwood. He continued to run freight wagons. He did not speak of straw tunnels again, and when other men mentioned them in his presence, he found reasons to be elsewhere. He was not converted. He was defeated. The distinction mattered because conversion requires a change of understanding, and Rook had never misunderstood the tunnel. He had understood it perfectly. He had understood that it threatened his business, and he had fought it the way a businessman fights a competitor, and he had lost because the competitor was not a man but a principle, and principles do not negotiate. Olive Kittredge came into Torgrim's life the way Marit had, through competence, not sentiment. After the April schoolhouse crisis, Olive had begun recording measurements. Not because Torgrim asked her to, but because she was a teacher, and teachers documented what they observed. She had a notebook, a lined composition book with a marbled cover, and in it she wrote the dimensions of every straw entry she encountered: length, width, height, number of turns, thickness of walls, type of daubing, condition of base, fuel consumption reported by the family. She visited 7 homesteads between April and August of 1888 and filled 11 pages with numbers and sketches. She brought the notebook to Torgrim in September, when the first cool evenings made people think about winter again. She sat at his table and opened it and showed him what she had found. The data was clear. Entries with turns reduced fuel consumption more than entries without turns, regardless of length. Entries on raised bases lasted longer than entries on bare ground. Daubed entries outperformed undaubed entries by a margin that increased with wind speed. The relationship between wall thickness and heat retention was measurable. 2-bale thick walls performed noticeably better than 1-bale walls, and the difference widened in severe cold. "I am not an engineer," Olive said, "but I can count, and the numbers say the same thing your father said. Stop the wind. The cold has to crawl." Torgrim looked at the notebook. He looked at Olive. She was 26, thin-faced, steady-handed, and she had kept 11 children alive in a cellar by burning desk legs and reading primers aloud until her voice broke. She was not a woman who needed rescuing. She was a woman who needed information organized. "You wrote all this down," Torgrim said. "Someone should have written it down the first time. Measurements disappear when they live in one person's head." This was the beginning, and it did not feel like a beginning. It felt like a continuation, as if the work Marit had started and Torgrim had carried was now passing into a third pair of hands, and the passage was as natural as water finding a lower channel. Through the autumn of 1888, Olive came to Torgrim's cabin on Saturdays. She helped families plan entries. She taught children at the school to make smoke test boxes, small wooden frames with candle stubs and muslin covers, so they could test seams and gaps at home. She insisted that girls learn the method alongside boys, and when Warren Plum objected that his daughter had no need for construction knowledge, Olive said, "Your daughter may one day be a widow on a claim with 2 children and less than 2 cords of wood. Would you prefer she know how to stop the wind, or would you prefer she wait for a man to show her?" Warren, who had lost 2 fingertips to a blizzard he might have survived intact if he had listened to a Norwegian widower stacking straw, said nothing further on the subject. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened between measurements. Torgrim and Olive disagreed about notation. He described things in body lengths and arm loads. She wanted feet and inches and written records. They argued about whether the straw entry was an invention or an adaptation. Torgrim said his father's sheep barn was the invention, and everything after was application. Olive said the application to prairie conditions was its own act of creation. They agreed that the principle mattered more than the structure, and that the principle was simple enough to teach a child but complex enough to require practice. They married in November 1889, a year and 10 months after the blizzard. The wedding was at the schoolhouse. Ephraim Dace attended. Warren Plum attended with his wife and sons and his daughter, who had by then helped build 2 straw entries and could daub a seam faster than any of her brothers. Alva Rook did not attend, but he sent a sack of flour through his hired man, which was as close to a peace offering as his pride could manage. Maren and Bastian gained not a replacement for Guro, but another adult in the cabin who understood that survival was knowledge transferred, not luck endured. Olive brought her notebook. She brought her insistence on documentation. She brought a schoolteacher's patience for explaining things 9 times until the 9th explanation finally held. The years compress the way years do when the crisis is past and the work continues. By the early 1890s, a dozen cabins in the district had some form of straw vestibule, storm baffle, or bent entry. Not all were 20 feet. The Haugen widows' 12-foot passage survived 3 winters without major repair. The Flatnens' 8-foot dogleg needed new daubing every autumn but performed reliably each year. Soren Espeland expanded his 6-foot entry to 14 feet after his second child was born, and the number of daily door openings doubled. Torgrim improved his own claim in stages. He planted shelter belts when seedlings became available through a state nursery program, cottonwood and red cedar in rows along the north and west boundaries, the trees thin as broom handles in the first year and thick as fence posts by the 5th. He built a proper frame addition on the cabin's east side, doubling the living space with a real plank floor and glass windows that Olive had saved for out of her teaching salary. He acquired a second stove, a smaller box stove for the addition, and the combined heating capacity, paired with the tunnel's airlock effect, made the cabin comfortable in a way that would have seemed extravagant to the man who had stood in November 1887 counting 1 cord and 3/4. He left one section of the original straw tunnel preserved under a shed roof longer than was necessary. Partly because the tunnel still functioned, the entry through the old passage remained the winter door. even after the addition gave them a summer entrance on the east side, partly because people kept coming to see it, families from other districts, travelers passing through, a county official who was interested in construction methods for rural schoolhouses. They walked the passage, touched the walls, felt the stillness between the doglegs, and understood what Torgrim found difficult to explain in words, but what the tunnel explained in sensation. The wind stopped. Olive kept the notebook. It grew to 3 notebooks over 10 years. She recorded fuel savings, repair schedules, material quantities, design variations. Marin, who had held willow rods at 9 and carried sod blocks at 60 feet, learned to read the notebooks, and later taught from them when she became a teacher herself, at a school 30 miles west where the winters were just as hard and the principal was just as needed. Bastian, the child whose fever broke during the blizzard, grew up remembering the tunnel not as an invention, but as the place where the wind stopped shouting. He became a carpenter. He built frame houses with proper vestibules and double doors, and when asked where he learned to think about entries, he said, "My father built a hallway out of straw, and a woman named Marit taught him why it worked." Torgrim died in 1926, old enough to see automobiles pass the same road where Alva Rook had once hauled overpriced cordwood by wagon. Old enough to see the shelter belts he planted grow tall enough to break the wind themselves, doing at the property line what the tunnel had done at the door. Old enough to hold grandchildren in a cabin that had a proper porch and a furnace, and no need for straw bales against the entry. But the shed roof over the old tunnel section remained until the year he died, and when his children dismantled it that spring, they found the willow stakes still driven at 45 degrees through 3 courses of bales, exactly as Marit Tveit had taught, the straw compressed and darkened with age, but still holding the air still. By the 3rd winter after the blizzard, the settlement no longer laughed when straw was stacked near a door. Children knew to ask whether an entry turned. Women who had once twisted hay for fuel now twisted straw rope for seams. Ephraim Dace, the road overseer who had walked a dying man's property and pronounced it fatal, included windbreak at the door in his winter preparation advice alongside cordwood, chips, and clean water. He never said Torgrim's name when he gave the advice. He did not need to. Everyone knew where the idea came from, and everyone knew who had taught it, and everyone knew that the woman who had understood it best was buried on a quarter section 2 miles east with her husband Elling and a headstone that said nothing about straw. Torgrim Asen lived out his life on the same 160-acre claim he had nearly lost. Olive kept the notebooks until her hands could no longer hold a pencil, and Marin kept them after. On the shelf above the stove, next to Guro's reading primer and the charcoal drawing on a torn envelope, Marit's straw needle rested for decades. The wood darkened, the point still sharp, the curve worn smooth by hands that had known how to make the wind give up. After the original tunnel came down, after the shed roof was dismantled and the bales were scattered and the willow stakes were pulled from the ground and used for garden fencing, a strip of packed earth still ran crooked from the old cabin threshold, 20 feet long, 3 feet wide, with 2 bends where the doglegs had stood. Grass grew over most of it, and the sod blocks of the raised base sank into the soil, and the flat stones from the creek bed settled level with the ground. But in winter, when the snow fell on that stretch of earth, it lay differently there, shallower in the bends, deeper at the straight sections, curving around a path that no longer existed but that the ground remembered. The wind crossing the place where straw once stood between a family and the storm still turned where the walls had taught it to turn. The settlement had laughed because Torgrim Asen built a hallway out of straw. They remembered him because he understood that winter did not need to enter all at once.